pineapple, evidence, digestive timeline, and last meal analysis. We've walked through practice notes that required extended time and ransom amounts that revealed insider knowledge. We've traced maternal hearing that should have woken and handwriting that couldn't be excluded. And now we need to pause at something so ordinary, so mundane in the landscape of evidence that it sits almost invisible until we begin to ask what it means. We need to think about food, about a bowl on a kitchen table with pineapple and a serving spoon, about stomach contents analyzed during examination, about the simple biological fact that digestion operates on a clock that cannot be reset, that preserves timing with a precision that human testimony sometimes cannot match. Because here's what sits quietly in the evidence, waiting to be noticed. She ate pineapple shortly before she was lost. The partially digested fruit in her stomach tells us this with biological certainty. And that bowl on the table with its large serving spoon tells us where that pineapple likely came from. But the parents said she went to bed after arriving home, that she was carried sleeping from the car, that she never woke, never came downstairs, never ate anything after that final moment of being tucked into bed. And these two realities, what the biology tells us and what we were told happened, cannot both be true. Let's establish what we understand about digestion before we begin to unravel what this means for the timeline. From a physiological perspective, the human digestive system operates with remarkable consistency. When we eat, food begins immediate processing. Chewing breaks it down mechanically. Saliva begins chemical digestion. The stomach continues both mechanical and chemical breakdown. Different foods digest at different rates based on their composition, but for most fruits, including pineapple, we can establish fairly precise windows for how long material remains in the stomach before passing into the small intestine. And pineapple, with its particular composition and the way it breaks down, leaves a signature that pathologists can recognize and can use to estimate how recently it was consumed. The examination revealed pineapple in her stomach, partially digested, in a state that told the examiner something crucial about timing, about when this food entered her system, and therefore when she must have been awake, conscious, eating. Theme 1, the biology of time. What digestion preserves and reveals. When we think about digestive timelines, we're thinking about one of the few biological processes that operates independently of human intention or memory. From a forensic perspective, digestion is a clock that cannot be manipulated, that records time with a precision that makes it invaluable in establishing timelines. The stomach processes food at rates that have been extensively studied and documented. For fresh pineapple, depending on various factors like the size of the pieces and what else was consumed with it, gastric emptying typically begins within 30 minutes to an hour, with partial digestion occurring throughout that window. The state of the pineapple found during examination, the degree of breakdown, the amount remaining in the stomach, allowed forensic pathologists to work backward to establish an approximate time of consumption. And that time created a problem for the timeline we were given, a rupture that has never been adequately explained or reconciled. Let's think about what partially digested means in this context. From a physiological standpoint, when fruit enters the stomach, it immediately begins breaking down. Gastric acid and enzymes work on the material. Mechanical contractions mix and process the contents. and gradually the food breaks into smaller components that can pass into the small intestine. The degree of breakdown, how much the pineapple had been processed when examined, tells us about the window of time between consumption and when digestion stopped. Not a precise minute-by-minute account, but a window that can be estimated with reasonable accuracy based on what's known about normal gastric processing rates. And that window, according to the experts who examined the evidence, suggested she had eaten within a relatively short period before she was lost. Perhaps an hour or two at most, possibly even less, depending on various factors. This timing creates an immediate problem. If she went directly to bed after arriving home, if she never woke and came downstairs, when did she eat the pineapple? From a criminological perspective, stomach contents become crucial in cases where timeline is disputed or unclear. The biology doesn't lie in the way that human memory can be faulty, or testimony can be shaped by motive. Digestion simply proceeds according to physiological principles, creating a record of recent intake that persists even after life has ended. So when investigators found pineapple in her stomach in a state suggesting recent consumption, they had biological evidence that had to be reconciled with the narrative they'd been given. And attempts at reconciliation have created more questions than answers, suggestions that she might have eaten earlier than parents recalled, theories about snacking before bed that no one mentioned, explanations that require us to accept that significant events around bedtime were simply forgotten or misremembered by multiple people despite the clarity with which other elements of that evening were recalled. Now, let's consider what else the biological evidence tells us beyond just timing. From a psychological standpoint, eating is typically a conscious, intentional activity. Children don't sleepwalk to kitchens and consume fruit in ways that leave serving bowls with spoons on tables. If she ate pineapple shortly before she was lost, she was awake, she was mobile, she was in a state where eating felt natural or desirable. This isn't consistent with a child who was carried sleeping from a car and remained asleep until someone came to her room with harmful intent. This is consistent with a child who woke or never fully went to sleep, who came downstairs for reasons children come downstairs in the middle of the night, hunger, thirst, checking on something, responding to sounds, or the awareness that someone else was awake. The biology tells us not just when she ate, but that she was conscious and functioning in a way that contradicts certain narratives about that night. Let's shift to thinking about the bowl itself and what it reveals. From an anthropological perspective, the way food is served and consumed tells us about social context and relationship. A bowl of pineapple with a large serving spoon isn't typically something a 6-year-old would prepare for herself. The bowl was adult-sized. The spoon was a serving utensil rather than an eating utensil. The presentation suggested someone had prepared this food and made it available, and that someone either consumed it with her or allowed her to consume it while they were present. Because 6-year-olds eating pineapple with large serving spoons typically have adults nearby to supervise, to help if needed, to ensure the child doesn't make a mess or struggle with utensils not sized for small hands. So, the bowl tells us not just that she ate, but that she likely wasn't alone when she ate, that someone else was present in the kitchen during those hours when the official timeline says everyone was asleep. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask, what does it mean when physical evidence contradicts testimony? When biology preserves a record that doesn't align with what we're told occurred? Which do we believe? The human tendency is to try to reconcile, to find ways that both can be true, to create explanations that allow us to accept testimony while also accepting physical evidence. But sometimes reconciliation isn't possible. Sometimes we're forced to choose which version of events makes more sense given the totality of what we know. And the pineapple evidence, combined with all the other elements we've examined, the extended time required for staging, the insider knowledge in the ransom note, the handwriting that couldn't be excluded, the maternal hearing that should have detected what neighbors heard, creates a pattern where physical evidence consistently points in one direction while testimony points in another. At some point, the weight of physical evidence becomes too substantial to explain away, and we're left confronting the uncomfortable possibility that what we were told simply isn't what happened. From a physiological standpoint, let's consider what would have been required for the pineapple to be consumed at the time the biological evidence suggests. She would have needed to be awake and functioning. She would have needed to be in the kitchen where the bowl was found. She would have needed either to serve herself or to have someone serve her. And all of this would have needed to occur during the hours when we're told everyone was asleep, when the house was supposedly quiet and undisturbed until morning. The biological evidence refuses to fit into that narrative. It insists on a different timeline, one where she was awake and active during hours when the official account says she was sleeping, one where someone else may have been awake as well, present in the kitchen, aware of her presence and her consumption of food that would become the last thing she ever ate. So when we step back and consider the biology of time, what digestion preserves, what stomach contents reveal, what the state of partially processed pineapple tells us about when it was consumed, we're looking at evidence that operates independently of human intention or testimony. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the pineapple. Evidence creates a rupture in the official timeline that no explanation has successfully sealed. The biology says she ate not long before she was lost. The bowl says someone made that food available. The parents' statements say she never woke after being put to bed. These three facts cannot all be true simultaneously. And when we're forced to choose which version of reality the evidence supports, the biology, unchangeable, uninfluenced by motive or memory, whispers that something occurred during those hours that we haven't been told, that she was awake when the official timeline says she was sleeping, that someone else knew she was awake because they were there, in that kitchen, during the hours when the terrible events of that night were unfolding in ways that no amount of testimony has ever quite managed to explain. Theme 2. The question of awareness. What parents know about night eating. We've established that the biology creates a timeline problem, and now we need to think about what the pineapple evidence reveals about awareness and knowledge. Because it's not just that she ate, it's whether anyone knew she ate, whether parents were aware that their daughter had consumed food during hours when they said she was sleeping. From a psychological perspective, parents typically know when their children eat, especially when that eating occurs at unusual times. Nighttime eating by a 6-year-old isn't something that typically happens without parental awareness. So the pineapple creates a question. Did the parents genuinely not know she had eaten? Or did they know, but have reasons not to acknowledge that knowledge? And both possibilities create problems for the official narrative, problems that ripple through everything else we've been told about that night. Let's think about what it means if the parents genuinely didn't know about the pineapple. From a logical standpoint, this would require that she woke on her own, came downstairs without their awareness, found and consumed the pineapple, and then encountered whatever terrible circumstances led to her being lost, all without the parents ever knowing she had left her bed. But this creates multiple problems. If she was awake and moving through the house, if she was in the kitchen consuming food, why didn't parental hearing detect this activity? We've already examined how maternal auditory systems maintain vigilance even during sleep, how sounds of a child moving through a house typically trigger at least partial waking, checking, awareness that something is occurring. If she was up eating pineapple, the sounds of that activity, opening the refrigerator perhaps, getting a bowl, moving through the kitchen, should have created enough acoustic disturbance to prompt at least one parent to check on her. The fact that no such checking apparently occurred suggests either remarkably deep sleep, despite all the factors we've discussed that should have maintained vigilance, or it suggests that someone did know she was up, did hear or see her activity, but for reasons we need to examine, that awareness has never been acknowledged. From a criminological perspective, when witnesses fail to mention significant details that they should have been aware of, investigators look for explanations. Sometimes it's simple forgetfulness. Details that seemed unimportant at the time fade from memory. Sometimes it's trauma-related amnesia. Events are too painful to remember consciously. And sometimes it's motivated omission. Details are known but not shared because sharing them would create problems for the narrative being constructed. The pineapple falls into a category that makes simple forgetfulness problematic. This wasn't a minor detail. This was the last food their daughter consumed before she was lost. If parents had been aware she was up eating, that awareness would have been seared into memory precisely because it represented her final normal activity, her last moment of ordinary childhood behavior before everything went terribly wrong. The fact that this awareness, if it existed, was never mentioned, suggests something more complex than simple forgetting. Now let's consider what it would mean if someone was present when she ate the pineapple. From an anthropological perspective, eating is often a social activity, especially in family contexts. The bowl on the table with its serving spoon suggests food that was prepared and made available, not food a 6-year-old would typically get for herself. So, if she was eating, someone may have been with her, perhaps preparing the food, perhaps eating as well, perhaps simply present while she consumed what had been made available. And if someone was present, then that person knows what we've been trying to reconstruct through forensic analysis and biological evidence. They know what time she ate, what state she was in, what conversation, if any, occurred, what happened after the eating ended. That person's knowledge would be direct and unambiguous, not filtered through the uncertainties of pathology and digestive rates. And yet, No one has come forward to say, yes, I was with her when she ate the pineapple. No one has acknowledged being the adult who prepared or supervised this final snack. Let's shift to thinking about the psychological implications of this silence. From a psychological perspective, if parents knew their daughter had eaten pineapple shortly before she was lost, why wouldn't they mention this? The answer that makes sense, because acknowledging the pineapple means acknowledging she was awake during hours when their narrative requires her to be asleep. It means acknowledging someone else may have been awake as well, present in the kitchen, aware of her activity. It means creating questions about who was with her, what else occurred during those hours, why the sequence of events being described doesn't include this significant element of her being up and active. The silence around the pineapple, if it represents conscious omission rather than genuine lack of knowledge, becomes part of the pattern of gaps we've been examining, spaces in the narrative where things that should be explained aren't explained, where details that should be acknowledged remain carefully unmentioned. From a philosophical standpoint, we need to think about what truth-telling requires when truth itself threatens the narrative you need to maintain. If parents were involved in staging, if they were trying to create the appearance that something happened differently than it actually did, then acknowledging the pineapple becomes problematic. It places their daughter awake and active during hours when they need her to have been asleep. It suggests adult presence in the kitchen when they need everyone to have been in their beds. It creates timeline problems that make staging more apparent and make the official narrative harder to sustain. So silence about the pineapple, even if awareness existed, might feel necessary, might seem like the only way to maintain the fragile construction of alternative explanation. But physical evidence doesn't participate in that construction. The pineapple existed in her stomach regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. The bowl sat on that table regardless of whether anyone explained it. And the biological clock of digestion recorded timing regardless of whether that timing created problems for the narrative we were meant to believe. From a criminological perspective, let's consider what patterns of knowledge and omission tell us about positioning relative to events. People who are genuinely disconnected from events, who have no special knowledge beyond what they observed directly, typically share information readily when asked. They don't have to calculate what details support their narrative and what details undermine it, because they're not managing a narrative. They're simply reporting what they know. But people who are managing information, who are trying to shape how events are understood, often show patterns of selective disclosure. Details that support their version of events are mentioned freely and repeatedly. Details that create problems for their version are omitted, minimized, or explained away in ways that feel strained. The pineapple evidence, with its apparent absence from initial parental statements, despite its obvious significance, fits the pattern of information that created problems for the narrative being presented and therefore needed to remain carefully unacknowledged. So, when we consider the question of awareness, whether parents knew about the pineapple consumption, what their knowledge or lack of knowledge reveals, why significant details about their daughter's final meal seem to have been omitted from initial accounts, we're looking at evidence that compounds the biological timeline problem. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the silence around the pineapple becomes itself significant. It suggests either a remarkable gap in parental awareness during hours when vigilance should have been maintained, or it suggests knowledge that couldn't be acknowledged because acknowledgement would undermine the narrative being carefully constructed. Either possibility creates problems for the official account. Either possibility suggests that what we've been told about that night is incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. And the pineapple sits quietly in the evidence, refusing to be explained away, insisting through its biological testimony that she was awake, active, eating during hours when we're told she was sleeping, and that someone, whether they've acknowledged it or not, was aware of this because the food she consumed didn't prepare itself, didn't appear on that table without human agency, didn't get consumed in a kitchen where she was alone because 6-year-olds don't typically eat pineapple with serving spoons in the middle of the night without adult presence, or at least adult awareness nearby. Theme 3. The collapse of the official timeline. When biology refuses to cooperate. We've examined the biological evidence and the question of awareness, and now we need to confront what the pineapple evidence ultimately means for the timeline we've been given. Because this isn't just another detail that creates questions. This is evidence that fundamentally undermines the sequence of events we were told occurred. From a logical perspective, the official timeline requires that she went to bed after arriving home and remained asleep until someone entered her room with harmful intent. But the pineapple evidence insists she was awake and eating within an hour or two before she was lost. These two versions of reality cannot coexist. One of them must give way. And when we examine which version has the weight of physical evidence behind it, and which version depends entirely on testimony that has been shown to have significant gaps and inconsistencies, the choice becomes clearer than those managing the narrative would prefer. Let's trace through what the official timeline asks us to believe and where the pineapple creates irreconcilable problems. We're told the family arrived home from a Christmas party. The children were tired. She was carried sleeping from the car, changed into night clothes, put to bed. She never woke. The parents went to their own bed. Everyone slept until an intruder somehow entered the house, navigated to her bedroom, removed her without waking the household, and then events unfolded that led to the terrible outcome. This timeline requires her to have been asleep from arrival home until the intruder's actions. But the pineapple says she was awake and consuming food. From a physiological standpoint, these facts cannot both be true. Either she wasn't carried sleeping and put to bed as described, or she woke after being put to bed and came downstairs, or the sequence of events being described simply didn't happen as we've been told. And each alternative creates its own problems for the official narrative. From a criminological perspective, when physical evidence contradicts witness statements, investigators must determine which is more reliable. And in cases where witnesses have potential motive to shape their narrative, where truth might create problems for them while certain versions of events might protect them, physical evidence typically receives greater weight than testimony. The pineapple evidence is physical. It's biological. It existed in her stomach in a state that allowed forensic determination of approximate timing. It cannot be explained away by faulty memory or trauma-induced confusion. It simply is a fact that must be accounted for in any honest reconstruction of that night's events. And attempts to account for it while maintaining the official timeline have required increasingly strained explanations that themselves create more questions than they answer. Now, let's think about what alternative explanations have been offered and why they fail to resolve the timeline problem. Some have suggested she might have eaten pineapple earlier in the evening, that the digestion timeline might be less precise than pathologists suggested. From a physiological perspective, while digestion rates can vary somewhat based on individual factors, the variation isn't enough to bridge the gap between eating hours earlier versus eating shortly before death. The state of the material in her stomach was inconsistent with consumption many hours prior. Other explanations suggest she might have woken briefly and eaten without parents knowing, but this still contradicts the official narrative that she remained asleep, and it raises all the questions we've explored about parental awareness and the likelihood of such activity occurring without detection. Every alternative offered to preserve the official timeline creates as many problems as it solves, leaving us with the uncomfortable recognition that maybe the timeline itself is the problem, that maybe what we need isn't better explanations, but honest acknowledgement that the sequence of events we were given doesn't match what the evidence reveals. Let's shift to thinking about what the correct timeline might actually look like if we follow the evidence rather than trying to make evidence fit predetermined narrative. From a logical standpoint, the pineapple tells us she was awake and eating within an hour or two before she was lost. The bowl on the table tells us this occurred in the kitchen. The absence of parental acknowledgement suggests either they genuinely didn't know or they have reasons not to acknowledge knowledge. If we construct a timeline that honors these facts, we get something different from the official account. We get a child who was awake during hours when everyone was supposedly asleep. We get adult presence, or at least adult knowledge of that wakefulness. We get a sequence of events that places her in the kitchen shortly before whatever occurred in the basement, creating the possibility that events unfolded, not because an intruder broke in, but because family members were already awake, already interacting, already in a situation that somehow escalated beyond anyone's ability to control it. From an anthropological lens, we need to understand that official timelines in cases like this serve a function beyond simply describing what happened. They create a framework for understanding that directs investigation, that shapes public perception, that determines where scrutiny falls and where it's deflected. If the official timeline places the child asleep in her bed until an intruder acted, investigation naturally focuses outward, looking for evidence of external entry, trying to identify who might have broken in, treating the family as victims rather than potential suspects. But if the timeline acknowledges the child was awake and in the kitchen with family members present, investigation necessarily shifts inward, asking what was happening during those hours, why events unfolded as they did, what circumstances led from a kitchen snack to tragedy in the basement. The resistance to acknowledging what the pineapple evidence reveals might reflect not just innocent memory gaps, but calculated understanding of how timeline shapes investigation and what truths need to remain obscured. From a philosophical perspective, we're confronting questions about narrative and truth, about what happens when the stories we're told cannot contain the evidence that exists. The official timeline is a narrative, a story about what happened, constructed from testimony and shaped by the needs and motives of those providing that testimony. The pineapple evidence is truth, physical, biological, indifferent to narrative needs. And when narrative and truth collide, when the story cannot accommodate the facts, we're forced to question the story rather than explaining away the facts. This is uncomfortable work. It means acknowledging that people we might want to believe were truthful may have been managing information rather than simply reporting it. It means recognizing that the timeline we've operated from for years might be fundamentally flawed, built on testimony that served narrative needs rather than describing actual events. But discomfort doesn't make the work less necessary. The pineapple evidence exists. It tells us she was awake and eating, and no amount of discomfort with what that means for the official timeline can change the biological fact of what was found in her stomach. So, when we consider the collapse of the official timeline, how the pineapple evidence undermines the sequence of events we were given, why attempts to reconcile biology and testimony have failed, what following the evidence rather than defending the narrative would require us to acknowledge. We're seeing the culmination of all the ruptures we've been examining. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the timeline cannot hold. It fractures under the weight of evidence that refuses to cooperate with the story we were told. She was awake when she should have been asleep, according to the narrative. She was in the kitchen when she should have been in her bed. She consumed food that someone prepared or made available, suggesting adult presence or awareness that has never been properly acknowledged. And these facts, combined with everything else we've examined, the extended staging time, the insider knowledge in the ransom note, the handwriting that couldn't be excluded, the windows that stayed closed, the maternal hearing that should have detected disturbance, create a pattern where physical evidence consistently points toward family involvement, while testimony consistently points away from it. At some point, the weight of evidence becomes too heavy to ignore, the pattern too clear to dismiss as coincidence, and we're left with the uncomfortable recognition that what happened that night wasn't what we've been told. The pineapple evidence, perhaps more than any other single element, forces this recognition because it's so simple, so biological, so impossible to explain away. She ate. The biology recorded when, and that when doesn't fit with the story we were given about that night. Everything else follows from accepting this simple fact and asking what it means for our understanding of who knew what, who was present when, and what really happened during those hours between the last time she was seen publicly at that Christmas party and the morning when someone called 911 to report what they claim to have just discovered. We've walked through the biology that cannot be manipulated and the timeline that cannot be maintained, examined the silence around awareness and the collapse of the official account under the weight of simple physical evidence. What emerges isn't speculation or theory. It's recognition that the pineapple evidence refuses to cooperate with the story we were told. She ate within an hour or two before she was lost. Someone made that food available. The bowl sat on the table as testimony to activity during hours when everyone was supposedly asleep. And no explanation offered has successfully bridged the gap between these biological and physical facts and the testimony that requires her to have been sleeping undisturbed until an intruder's actions. The pineapple becomes a kind of key, unlocking the recognition that the official timeline was constructed to serve narrative needs rather than to accurately describe events. And once that timeline collapses, once we acknowledge that she was awake and active during hours when we were told she was sleeping, everything else we've examined falls into new alignment. The extended staging time makes sense if family members were already awake. The insider knowledge makes sense if the note was written by someone who lived there. The handwriting similarities make sense if Patsy was the author. The closed windows make sense if no one needed to escape. The maternal hearing makes sense if what needed to be concealed wasn't an intruder's actions, but something that happened within the family. The pineapple doesn't stand alone. It sits at the center of a web of evidence, each thread connecting to others, each detail reinforcing the pattern, until the truth that was meant to stay hidden refuses to remain quiet any longer. She was awake. Someone knew. And what followed wasn't what we've been told. It was something that required hours of staging, something that needed elaborate explanation, something too terrible to acknowledge directly, and so had to be buried beneath layers of false timeline and alternative narrative and carefully maintained silence about a bowl of pineapple sitting on a kitchen table, bearing witness to the truth that no amount of testimony has ever quite managed to conceal.